A human body can endure far more than we like to believe. It doesn't shut down at the first sign of agony. The nerves keep screaming long after the soul has stopped fighting. The heart still pounds, the lungs still gasp. The brain, cruelly, stays awake, aware, feeling everything. This isn't mercy. It's biology at its most brutal. And in the hands of medieval executioners, it became a terrifying tool. No death in British history reflects this cold, calculated cruelty more than that of Sir William Wallace, the man the English labeled a traitor and the Scots remember as a hero. You might think you know how Wallace died. Maybe you've seen it dramatized in film or reduced to a heroic footnote in some history book. But the truth? The actual physical horror of what was done to him? It's darker, it's colder, it's almost too disturbing for the history books. Wallace wasn't just executed, he was destroyed, methodically, piece by piece. This wasn't about removing a man, it was about erasing a symbol, breaking a soul, sending a message that would echo across generations. His death was a performance, staged in the heart of London, designed to burn a lesson into the public consciousness. This is what happens to those who dare to defy the crown. August 23, 1305, Smithfield. It wasn't just an execution. It was state-sponsored theater, complete with torture, humiliation, and psychological warfare. And every moment was meticulously planned to terrify, not just punish. This wasn't justice. It was domination, delivered with surgical cruelty. Wallace's execution wasn't a single act. It was a process, a slow, unfolding nightmare where each stage stripped him of something, his body, his pride, his name. And yet, even as they tore him apart, they couldn't fully destroy what he represented. You may think you know this story, but chances are you've only heard a version cleaned up by time and tailored for easier digestion. To truly understand what happened to Wallace, we have to scrape away the legends, the nationalism, the Hollywood gloss. We have to confront the raw, unfiltered reality of a man being dismantled not just by iron and fire, but by fear, spectacle, and the ruthless psychology of power. This isn't just the story of a martyr. It's the story of a man being unmade. This is the real execution of William Wallace. To many today, William Wallace is more legend than man, a defiant warrior whose final breath seemed to whisper freedom into the heart of a nation. But before he became a symbol, he was something far more dangerous to the English crown, an unpredictable man who refused to stay in his place. Wallace didn't rise from nobility. He wasn't a polished courtier or a military aristocrat. He was a landowner's son, a commoner, no title, no official rank. And that made him harder to control, because he didn't play by their rules. He emerged in one of the most chaotic moments in Scottish history. The throne was empty, the nobility divided, and Edward I of England, the hammer of the Scots, was tightening his grip. Edward didn't just want to conquer Scotland, he wanted to break it from the inside. He wanted the Scots to believe submission was not only inevitable, but righteous. Wallace didn't just resist, he embarrassed them. In 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace led a ragtag force of Scots to a shocking victory over a far superior English army. It wasn't just a battlefield triumph, it was a public humiliation. Trained knights, seasoned in the chivalric art of war, were outmaneuvered by a man they had branded an outlaw. Wallace became a knight that day, not by birth, but by fire. And shortly after, he was declared Guardian of Scotland. For a brief flickering moment, this untitled rebel became the unofficial voice of a nation that refused to kneel. But empires never forget humiliation. When Edward I personally returned to crush the rebellion, it wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about reclaiming control of the narrative. Wallace had become more than a man. He was an idea, and that, to an empire obsessed with order, was intolerable. Even after military losses, even after the Scottish nobility fractured and folded, Wallace wouldn't fade. He kept fighting, he kept escaping, he kept existing, and that was the real crime. Not the swords he raised, but the myth he kept alive. the idea that resistance was still possible. To the English crown, Wallace's greatest offense wasn't rebellion, it was hope. And so, when he was finally captured in 1305, betrayed by a fellow Scot, John de Menteith, the English didn't rush to end him. They staged it, they rehearsed it, they crafted an execution with such horrific precision it would serve as a centuries-long warning. This is what happens when you defy a king. Wallace, once feared on horseback with a broadsword in hand, was now a captive in chains, the lead actor in a gruesome play where death wasn't the punishment. It was the finale. His execution wasn't about law or justice, it was about erasing a symbol, dismantling not just the man, but everything he had come to represent. And that's exactly what they set out to do. Wallace didn't walk to his death that day. He was marched into a ritual of destruction, crafted not for him, but for everyone watching. The goal was never just to kill him. It was to unmake him, publicly, symbolically, completely. When William Wallace was captured in August 1305, it wasn't in some grand battle or noble standoff. There were no swords clashing, no last charge of defiance. He was handed over quietly, betrayed by one of his own. John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who had pledged loyalty to Edward I, delivered Wallace to the English in secret. Just like that, it was over. No fight, just a handover. But what followed was not just justice. It was revenge wrapped in ceremony. Wallace was shackled, not just to keep him from escaping, but to strip him of dignity. Every inch of his journey from Scotland to London was a calculated humiliation. He wasn't hidden away in chains. He was put on display, a traveling trophy for England's victory. Crowds were invited to mock him. He was paraded through towns like a beast, forced to ride in chains, often bareback, ensuring his muscles burned and his skin blistered. He was starved, denied sleep, not because they couldn't provide it, but because they chose not to. This wasn't transport, it was psychological torture on wheels. By the time he reached London, he wasn't just weakened, he was mentally worn down. The execution hadn't started yet, but the public spectacle had been running for days. The English didn't want to just kill Wallace, they wanted to erase him. And London welcomed him not with silence, but with cheers. Years of propaganda had done its job. Wallace wasn't seen as a soldier. He was a villain, a traitor, a monster. The people didn't see a man. They saw the boogeyman being dragged into daylight. Then came the trial, but it wasn't a trial in any true sense. It was a formality staged in Westminster Hall, the grand theater of royal justice. Wallace wasn't allowed to defend himself. No witnesses, no evidence, just a list of accusations written in ink that had already dried. Treason against Edward I, murder of English civilians and soldiers, sacrilege against the church, barbaric, dishonorable warfare. That last one said everything. Wallace was being punished not just for rebellion, but for fighting in a way they couldn't predict. He didn't follow the code of knights. He fought from the shadows, struck supply lines, ambushed convoys. He had humiliated England, and now they would humiliate him. But Wallace, even then, had one final truth to give. When they read the charge of treason, he replied, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." One sentence, one unflinching refusal to kneel, even at the edge of death. It wasn't just defiance, it was a direct denial of England's authority over Scotland. And it shook the room. At that moment, Wallace stopped being just a prisoner. He became something far more dangerous, a man who still believed in his freedom. There would be no mercy. The court didn't pause. There was no deliberation. The verdict was already written. William Wallace was sentenced, not simply to die, but to be unmade piece by piece. First, he would be hanged, but not to death, just enough to bring him near it. Then he would be emasculated, his genitals severed and burned before his eyes. Next, he would be eviscerated, his intestines slowly pulled from his body as he still breathed. Then his heart torn from his chest, a final insult to his spirit. Only then would his head be cut off, And finally, his body would be quartered, split into 4 parts, and scattered to the corners of England, a message carved in blood. It was not execution, it was erasure. And yet, centuries later, we still say his name. Every act of William Wallace's execution was a message. The hanging? That was meant to shame him. The castration? To erase his manhood and any hope of future lineage. The evisceration? To rip out the seat of rebellion, his very guts, the fire in his belly. The beheading? To silence him forever. And the quartering? That was the final insult, to scatter not just his body, but his legacy. These weren't the wild whims of a bloodthirsty age. They were strategy. Precision brutality designed not just to kill, but to communicate, to crush hope, to burn an image so deep into public memory that no one would dare to follow in his footsteps. Because empires don't just execute rebels, they unmake them, publicly, deliberately, piece by piece. And for Wallace, that unmaking began the moment they tied him to the horse. There are many ways to kill a man, but few are as slow, as humiliating, or as psychologically destructive as dragging him through the streets of a city that has been taught to hate him. His final journey began not with a priest's blessing, but with rope and raw dirt. Stripped nearly naked, Wallace's wrists and ankles were bound tight. But he wasn't placed on the horse. He was tied behind it. His body dragged across the cobbled streets of London, through mud, dung, animal waste, even human filth. And that wasn't a brutal oversight of the age. That was the sentence. To be drawn meant just that, to be displayed like meat, pulled through the capital like a trophy of conquest. From the Tower of London, through the busiest streets, he was paraded before thousands. Every corner turned was part of the plan. The route was long, not for distance, but for pain. Every jolt of the cart sent shockwaves through his bones. Every pothole ripped skin. Every thrown stone reminded him this wasn't just death, this was the rehearsal. And the people, they gathered in droves. Some jeered, some spat, others just watched with cold fascination. He was no longer a man. He was a warning on legs. Wallace wasn't dying yet, but he was being broken, prepared, not fattened for slaughter like an animal, worn down for it, emotionally, physically, spiritually, so that when the real torment began, there would be no strength left to resist. The dragging took hours, not because it had to, but because that was the point. Slower meant louder. Every painful scrape over cobblestones, every jolt of agony, every cheer and insult, it all chipped away at him. To the crown, Wallace was no longer a man. He was a moving parable, a gruesome reminder of what happens when you not only raise a sword against the king, but when you refuse to bow. Imagine the sound, the constant roar of a crowd, drunk on vengeance and spectacle. Imagine the smell, blood, filth, sweat, and smoke. Imagine the chaos, dying in public before death even arrives. This wasn't just execution, it was psychological warfare, and the blade hadn't even touched him yet. For William Wallace, this was never just a path to death. It was a ritual erasure, a slow, methodical unraveling of everything he had ever stood for. Because Edward I didn't simply want Wallace gone, he wanted him obliterated, not just executed, but erased, transformed from man to monster to nothing. Even the setting whispered symbolism. Smithfield, a place where livestock was bought and sold and where criminals were publicly slaughtered. The message? Clear as blood on butchers' hands. Wallace wouldn't die as a knight, not even as a man. He would die like meat, dragged, cut, and divided before a hungry crowd, a carcass, not a cause. And yet, Wallace remained. Accounts say he did not beg. He didn't scream. He stood in silence, wounded, humiliated, beaten beyond recognition, but not broken. But silence isn't peace. Silence is survival. The last defense of a soul being torn apart. By the time he reached Smithfield, bleeding, filthy, stripped of dignity, the man inside had already been executed long before the knife touched skin. What followed was not a single act of violence. It was a sequence, each cut, each motion, each moment meticulously planned. This was no justice. This was theater. and the curtain had just risen. The first instrument wasn't steel, it was rope. Smithfield was packed, thousands pressed together under a gray sky, buzzing, not with grief but anticipation. They weren't here to witness justice. They were here for a spectacle, to feel the crown's power, not in gold or law, but in blood and suffering. Wallace, filthy and broken from hours of dragging, now stood at the scaffold. But the end was still far away. The first phase of his sentence was hanging, but not to kill him, to bring him right to the edge. In medieval England, hanging wasn't clinical. There were no trapdoors, no snap of the neck. It was raw, manual, cruel. The condemned were lifted, slowly, by rope and muscle, left to dangle, to choke, to kick, just above the ground, their lungs burning and limbs flailing. But Wallace? He was never meant to die there. This hanging was a rehearsal, a simulation. He would feel death crawl up his throat, and then be ripped back from it, gasping, convulsing, still alive. Because death wasn't the point. The pain was. This was the beginning of a message, not in words, but in flesh. And the worst was yet to come. He was bound tightly, a rough rope looped around his neck, no snap, no sudden drop. He was lifted, slowly, like meat on a hook. This wasn't hanging to kill, it was hanging to suffocate, inch by inch, breath by stolen breath. Witnesses say his body convulsed, his chest heaved, legs kicked wildly, his face darkened, not from fear, but from a cruel, creeping lack of oxygen. His throat ballooned, his tongue pushed from his mouth like it too was trying to escape the agony. And just as the blackness started to close in, they cut him down. He collapsed in a heap, hard, broken, choking on spit and blood, gagging, gasping, but alive and awake. Because the next part required it. This wasn't punishment, it was preparation. The partial hanging wasn't meant to kill him, it was meant to disorient him, to scramble the senses, to tear apart his grip on reality. A line blurred between death and life, between pain and the memory of pain. To the crowd, it was the opening act. To Wallace, it was the first crack in the mirror of his soul. Today, psychologists would call it trauma conditioning. Interrogators might call it controlled asphyxiation. Back then, they called it justice. But this was not justice. It was a statement, a spectacle tailored to break a symbol, not just a body. Wallace now lay at the foot of the scaffold, his limbs twitching, his breath ragged, his mind blinking in and out of clarity, exactly where they wanted him. Because what came next wasn't just designed to kill, it was designed to teach. He had to see it, he had to feel it, he had to understand it. Because this wasn't just about Wallace, it was about everyone watching. It was about Scotland, it was about rebellion, it was about making hope look like madness. The man on the scaffold was no longer William Wallace. He was a message, a body transformed into a canvas on which the crown would now draw its final warning. The hangman stepped back. From his belt he pulled a knife, not long and elegant, but short, hooked and cruel. The air changed. The spectacle shifted. It was no longer punishment. It wasn't even revenge. It was surgery, public, deliberate, and silent. Wallace lay gasping, his lungs still trying to breathe through a throat that had nearly closed. His eyes, swollen but open. His body, waiting for the blade. And no words were spoken. Only the sound of steel leaving leather. And with that first slice, the horror began. The knife wasn't made for mercy. It wasn't swift, clean, or meant to end anything quickly. It was small, serrated, designed not to kill, but to open. The executioner didn't hesitate. He moved with the grim efficiency of someone who had done this before. The first target was not the heart, not the head, but his manhood. Wallace's genitals were severed in a single, brutal motion, then held aloft like a trophy before the crowd. Cheers rose, laughter, gasps, and then they were tossed into the fire at his feet. A symbolic incineration of everything a man was supposed to be, his masculinity, his lineage, his future. It wasn't just mutilation, it was message. This is what happens when you defy the crown. This is how the English don't just kill rebellion, they burn its ability to be born again. And Wallace, he saw it, he felt it, but he was still breathing, still aware. And now came the part meant to shatter him. The knife moved lower. With slow, deliberate strokes, the executioner opened Wallace's abdomen, like a butcher working not on a man, but a specimen. His intestines were pulled out, inch by inch, foot after foot, still warm, still living, still tethered to a body that refused to die. Each pull wasn't just gore. It was a declaration. You are being undone from the inside out. The crowd didn't see a man in agony. They saw a body being unwritten, a symbol being peeled back, layer by layer, until nothing recognizable remained. And Wallace was still conscious. His chest rose and fell. His limbs twitched. And, according to more than one chronicler, his eyes tracked the movements of his own entrails, as they were tossed into the same fire that had devoured his manhood. Imagine that, watching your own body feed a flame meant for public entertainment. This wasn't execution, it was ritual erasure, a psychological and spiritual unmaking. Modern science tells us a man in that condition might remain aware for several minutes, maybe longer, his brain flooded with adrenaline, trauma-induced clarity, and raw biological instinct. Which means Wallace didn't just feel the knife. He heard his breathing change. He smelled his own burning flesh. He may have known in full, terrible clarity that he was being systematically dismantled. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't justice. It was performance art in the name of empire. Even the chroniclers, those who approved of this act, recorded it with chilling detail. Not because they were ashamed, but because they were proud. This wasn't just for the crowd at Smithfield, it was for history. An execution, yes, but also a textbook, a lesson in domination. And as the executioner reached into Wallace's chest, cutting through flesh and cartilage to pull free the still beating heart, the performance reached its final crescendo. The heart, that symbol of courage, rebellion, life, held high, then flung onto the fire without ceremony, not just to kill him, but to send one last savage message. You are not just dead, you are undone. And still, it wasn't over. Because killing William Wallace wasn't enough. Not for Edward, not for the Empire. A single death, a single corpse, that would have left a place for memory, a grave to mourn, a body to bury. But Wallace wasn't allowed to rest. He had to be erased. The final act was not about death, it was about control, of his story, of his legacy, of what people were allowed to remember. By the time his heart was torn out and fed to the flames, Wallace was gone, or close enough. What remained on the scaffold wasn't a man, it was a message. And messages had to be broken, not buried. First, the beheading. Clean, or as clean as an iron axe could manage. His head, still slick with blood, was dipped in boiling tar, not for preservation, but for display. Not for mourning, but for warning. It was mounted on a pike atop the southern gate of London Bridge, facing the road, so that every traveler entering the capital would look up and see the cost of defiance. No inscription was needed. The face, blackened by sun and tar, said everything. This is what happens when you raise your hand against a king. But that was just the beginning. Next came the quartering. His body was hacked apart, limbs and torso separated with axes and knives, bones shattered for transportation. Each piece became a courier of fear, sent to places where his name still lingered like smoke. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, England's northern edge, always watching Scotland. Another to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a town constantly pulled between borders, now forced to remember who was in charge. A third went to Stirling, where Wallace had once stood victorious. The last to Perth, where rebellion still smoldered under the surface. This wasn't logistics, it was geopolitical theater. Each fragment was mounted in public view, hung on gates nailed above walkways, exposed to rot, wind, and flies. Not hidden, celebrated. People didn't just pass by them, they grew up with them. Children pointed, merchants whispered, priests walked beneath them on the way to Mass. Every torn limb of Wallace became a teacher, delivering one brutal lesson. We don't just kill those who resist. We scatter them. We disassemble them. We turn them into landmarks of fear. This wasn't senseless cruelty. It was strategy, a masterclass in psychological warfare, taught not through books, but through bodies. The Empire wasn't silencing Wallace. It was trying to rewrite him, and yet it failed, because something happened in the shadows of those swinging limbs. In the hush of night, in taverns and forests, in whispered songs and outlawed stories, Wallace began to live again, not in his body, but in his legend. He wasn't buried, but he was planted, and from the places his pieces hung, something else began to grow. Not fear, but fire. Not silence, but song. And the more the Empire tried to make him vanish, the louder his memory became. William Wallace had no grave, but he had a country. He had a voice. He had a cause. And while his body was scattered to the corners of the kingdom, his rebellion was just taking root.